let me ask you something that seems very simple at first. If someone says, "That's just common sense," what do you think they mean? Most learners will immediately connect that to something like general knowledge, things that everyone knows, things that are basic or obvious because they are widely taught or widely understood. But if you listen carefully to how native speakers actually use that phrase, you'll start to notice that it doesn't quite match that idea. And once you see the difference, you begin to understand something much deeper about how English organizes meaning. Hello, I'm Teacher Sammy.
And I'm Jonathan.
This is Sammy's English in Asia, where we look at how English is actually used in real situations, not just definitions, but how meaning is shaped in everyday conversation.
And today we're going to look at a pair of ideas that seem very similar on the surface, but are actually quite different once you start paying attention. Common sense and what many learners think it means. So let's start from the assumption that most learners naturally make because it's very understandable. When people hear the phrase common sense, they often think it refers to knowledge that most people share, something like basic facts or information that everyone knows.
Yes, and that interpretation makes sense if you look at the words individually. Common suggests something shared, and sense might suggest understanding or awareness.
So it feels like it should mean shared knowledge.
Exactly, but in actual English usage, that's not really what the phrase is doing.
So if it's not about shared knowledge, what is it about?
It's about judgment. More specifically, it's about the ability to make reasonable decisions based on everyday experience.
So instead of asking, "Do you know this?" the question becomes, "Do you understand how to act in this situation?"
Yes, and that's a very important shift, because now we're not talking about information, we're talking about behavior.
And that already changes how we interpret the phrase. If someone says, "That's common sense," they're not testing your knowledge.
They're evaluating your judgment.
And that evaluation often comes with a certain expectation.
Yes, it suggests that the answer should be obvious, even if no one has explicitly explained it.
Okay, let's take a simple situation and slow it down a bit. Imagine you walk into a room and see that the floor is wet. Maybe someone just cleaned it, or maybe something spilled.
You don't need anyone to explain what to do next.
You instinctively adjust your behavior. You walk more carefully, or you avoid that area entirely.
And if someone ignored that and slipped, another person might say, "Well, expecting the wet floor to be slippery is just common sense."
Notice what's happening, pair. No one is saying you should have studied this fact.
Right, they're saying you should have recognized the situation and responded appropriately.
Now, let's compare that to something like knowing that Paris is the capital of France.
That's clearly general knowledge or common knowledge.
Right. It's information that you learn, remember, and can repeat when asked.
But knowing that fact doesn't guide your behavior in most everyday situations.
And more importantly, if you don't know it, people don't usually say it's common sense.
Right, they might say you should know that, but it's a different kind of expectation.
So maybe the clearest way to think about this is that general knowledge is about what you know, while common sense is about how you interpret and respond to situations.
Yes, and the second part is often much less clearly defined.
Because it depends on experience, context, and sometimes even culture.
Exactly, and that's where things become interesting for learners.
Because if you're learning English through translation, It's very easy to map common sense onto something like basic knowledge.
And once that mapping is in your mind, it's hard to notice that the actual usage is different.
So you might hear someone say, "That's just common sense," and interpret it as, "This is something everyone knows."
When in reality, the speaker is saying something closer to, "This is something you should have recognized or figured out on your own."
And that difference matters, especially in tone.
Yes, because common sense is often not a neutral phrase.
It can sound slightly critical, even if it's not intended to be harsh.
Because it implies that the listener has failed to meet an expectation.
For example, imagine someone forgets to bring an umbrella when it's clearly about to rain.
Another person might say, "That's just common sense."
But what they really mean is, "You should have thought about this."
Right, so the phrase carries both meaning and attitude. It might even be a little insulting, suggesting that the person was unwise, foolish, or even stupid.
And then there's another layer, which makes this even more complex. What counts as common sense is not always the same across cultures.
Yes, and this is something learners often don't expect.
Because the phrase sounds universal.
But the expectations behind it are often local.
For example, in many parts of Asia, it may be considered common sense to take off your shoes before entering someone's home.
But in Western contexts, that's not typically expected.
So if someone says, "That's just common sense," they're really saying, "This is what people like me consider obvious."
Not necessarily what everyone in the world considers obvious.
And that brings us to something deeper about how English works. A lot of communication relies on shared assumptions that are never stated directly.
Yes, and common sense is one of the clearest examples of that.
It refers to knowledge that is not formally taught but is still expected.
And that expectation is what gives the phrase its power.
Let's imagine a more complete conversation. Someone says, "Why didn't you check the time before leaving?" The other person says, "I didn't think it was necessary."
And the response might be, "That's just common sense."
Which really means, in this situation, checking the time should have been obvious.
And that meaning is much stronger than simply saying you didn't know something.
So when we compare common sense and general knowledge, we're actually comparing two very different kinds of understanding.
One is about information that you learn.
The other is about how you apply understanding in real situations.
And the second one is often invisible until something goes wrong.
And that's why this distinction is so useful for learners. Because if you only focus on vocabulary as definitions, you miss how these words actually function in communication.
But once you understand how they're used, you start to hear the intention behind them.
And that makes your listening much more accurate.
So the next time you hear someone say, "That's just common sense," don't think of it as a statement about knowledge.
Think of it as a statement about expectation.
About what the speaker believes should be obvious in that situation. Thanks for listening to Sammy's English in Asia.
And we hope this helps you understand not just what English words mean, but how they're actually used in real conversations.
We'll see you next time.